At night, when Rome finally fell silent, the most powerful man on earth lay awake, wishing he were anyone else. No crown on his head, no applause, no hunger for glory, just a tired mind wrestling with fear, duty, and the unbearable weight of command. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire of nearly 60 million souls, yet, in the privacy of his thoughts, he questioned whether power itself was a kind of disease. What if the greatest emperor in history never wanted to rule at all? What if the man we remember as a symbol of strength secretly longed for obscurity, simplicity, and sleep? Tonight, you're about to enter those private thoughts. Not the polished quotes carved into stone, but the forbidden inner world of a ruler who hated power, even as history forced it into his hands. Stay with me. Because once you hear what Marcus Aurelius whispered to himself in the dark, you'll never look at leadership or your own struggles the same way again. Before we continue, take a moment to gently support the channel. Like the video, subscribe if you enjoy deep, slow-burn historical storytelling, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from or what you do for a living. Many people listen to this series while working night shifts, studying, or trying to fall asleep. Your comment helps this quiet community find each other. Now, let us begin. Long before Rome ever spoke his name with reverence, before statues hardened his face into marble certainty, Marcus Aurelius was simply a quiet child, watching the world more carefully than most. He was born into privilege, yes, but also into a household shaped by absence. His father died when Marcus was still very young, leaving behind not a heroic memory, but a silence. That silence would follow him for the rest of his life. In ancient Rome, boys were trained early to dominate, to speak loudly, to compete, to assert themselves in public spaces. Marcus did none of these things naturally. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed how adults performed confidence even when they were afraid. He sensed that power, when worn too eagerly, often concealed insecurity rather than strength. These were not thoughts a Roman boy was encouraged to have. But Marcus had them anyway. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, was wealthy, cultured, and deeply serious. From her, Marcus inherited discipline rather than indulgence. The household was not one of reckless luxury. Instead, it was marked by restraint, order, and an almost uncomfortable awareness of responsibility. Even as a child, Marcus sensed that privilege came with invisible debts. Comfort was never free. Someone, somewhere, always paid for it. At an age when other children were chasing games and applause, Marcus was already drawn towards solitude. He found comfort in routine, in simplicity, in the quiet repetition of learning. He was not gloomy, but he was inward, and Rome noticed this difference. Tutors were brought in early, the best money could buy: grammar, rhetoric, logic. But Marcus reacted strangely to praise. When his teachers applauded his intelligence, he did not swell with pride. He recoiled slightly, as if attention itself were a burden. Compliments made him uncomfortable. They felt unearned, dangerous. He sensed, without fully understanding, that admiration could corrupt judgment. One of his earliest tutors reportedly introduced him to philosophy before most boys were allowed near it. Not as ornamentation, but as discipline. Philosophy was not presented as clever argument, but as a way to endure life without becoming bitter. This mattered to Marcus more than anyone realized. He was already wrestling with questions most adults avoided. Why do people chase status if it never satisfies them? Why does loss arrive without warning? Why does power so often reveal the worst in those who hold it? there is a quiet but telling story from his youth. While other boys preferred soft clothing and ornamented surroundings, Marcus asked to sleep on a simple bed, sometimes even on the floor. Not out of rebellion, out of preparation, as if he were training himself for hardship that had not yet arrived, but that he somehow knew was coming. This was not asceticism for display. He did not announce it. He did not demand recognition. It was private, almost secret, a child teaching himself endurance before the world demanded it. Rome admired ambition. Marcus admired restraint. By his early teens, whispers began to circulate among the elite. The boy was unusual, not just intelligent, but morally serious. There was a gravity to him that felt misplaced in someone so young. He did not mock others. He did not posture. When insulted, he absorbed it quietly, studying the emotion rather than reacting to it. This made some adults uneasy, because Rome understood something instinctively. A man who does not crave power cannot be controlled by it, and such men are unpredictable. The Emperor Hadrian noticed Marcus early. Hadrian was no fool. He had ruled long enough to recognize when a mind operated differently. He saw in Marcus a rare combination: discipline without cruelty, intelligence without vanity, and perhaps most dangerously of all, a boy who did not need to be emperor. Hadrian summoned him to court. To most families, this would have been an honor beyond imagining, a door opening into destiny. But for Marcus, it felt more like gravity tightening its grip. The imperial court was loud, performative, full of ambition masquerading as virtue. Every gesture calculated, every word weighed for advantage. Marcus watched closely and felt out of place. He was given a nickname by Hadrian, one that sounded affectionate on the surface, but it carried an edge, a reminder that he was being observed, tested, measured. Marcus did not enjoy this attention. He did not shrink from duty, but he feared what prolonged exposure to power might do to him internally. Even as a teenager, he sensed that power demanded compromises. Small ones at first, a word softened here, a truth delayed there. Over time, those compromises hardened into character. This frightened him more than poverty ever could, so he retreated inward. When others slept, Marcus read. When others boasted, Marcus reflected. When others imagined futures of command and prestige, Marcus imagined something else entirely, a life of obscurity, of study, of moral clarity. He dreamed, not of ruling, but of being uncorrupted. And yet, the machinery of Rome was already turning. The empire did not care what Marcus wanted. Rome did not ask permission. Destiny, once noticed, rarely looks away. By the time Marcus reached adulthood, the path was narrowing. Adoption into the imperial line was discussed in quiet chambers. Plans were made without him present. Futures were rearranged with bureaucratic calm. The boy who never sought power was being positioned to inherit it. And still, he resisted. Not outwardly, but internally. He obeyed. He studied. He prepared. But his writings, even at this early stage, reveal something haunting. He did not think of power as a prize. He thought of it as a test, a moral hazard, a weight that could either crush a soul or reveal whether it had one at all. This inner tension between duty and desire, between destiny and dread, never left him. It would follow him into adulthood, into war, into illness, into the quiet hours of the night when the Emperor of Rome would remind himself, again and again, not to become the thing the world expected him to be. Because even as a child, Marcus Aurelius understood something most rulers learn too late. Power does not change who you are. It exposes it. And the boy who never wanted the throne was already preparing. For the moment, he would have no choice but to take it. The night deepens. The machinery of empire hums quietly in the distance. And somewhere inside the mind of a young philosopher, a question forms. Soft, persistent, and impossible to ignore. How do you rule the world without losing yourself? That question will carry us forward, into adoption, into obligation, into the moment destiny closes its grip, and Marcus Aurelius steps closer to the life he never asked for. In Rome, blood was respected, but continuity was worshipped. Empires could not afford uncertainty. A weak succession did not simply topple families. It fractured armies, emptied treasuries, and invited chaos. By the 2nd century, Rome had learned this lesson painfully. So emperors did something quietly radical. They chose their heirs. This is how destiny reached for Marcus Aurelius. Emperor Hadrian was aging, his health eroding in unpredictable waves. He had ruled with brilliance and cruelty in equal measure, and he knew how fragile power truly was. He had seen strong men crumble. He had watched the throne poison those who wanted it too much. And so, toward the end of his life, Hadrian searched not for ambition, but for restraint. His first choice failed him. The adopted heir died suddenly. As Rome so often reminds its rulers that planning is an illusion. Forced to choose again, Hadrian made a decision that would ripple through history. He adopted Antoninus Pius, a calm, steady administrator, and demanded, as a condition, that Antoninus adopt 2 boys in turn. One of them was Marcus. This was not a suggestion. It was imperial command disguised as generosity. When the decree was finalized, Marcus was still young, old enough to understand that his life had just been quietly taken out of his own hands. Adoption into the imperial line was framed as an honor, but Marcus felt its true meaning immediately. This was not belonging. It was conscription. He did not protest. In Rome, refusal was unthinkable. Gratitude was expected. Celebration was performed. But internally, something tightened. A door closed behind him. From that moment on, Marcus Aurelius was no longer merely a promising young philosopher. He was property of the state. Antoninus Pius became his adoptive father, a man radically different from Hadrian. Where Hadrian was restless and volatile, Antoninus was gentle, methodical, almost stubbornly decent. He governed without drama. He avoided unnecessary war. He listened more than he spoke. For Marcus, this mattered deeply. If he had to learn power, at least he would learn it from a man who did not enjoy cruelty. Life in Antoninus's household was disciplined but humane. There were no theatrical displays of authority, no obsessive paranoia. Instead, Marcus observed something rare: power worn lightly. Antoninus rose early, worked steadily, and treated subordinates with respect. He did not posture as a god. He acted like a caretaker. This became Marcus's first living model of what leadership could be, if one resisted its temptations. Yet the training was relentless. Marcus's education intensified. Rhetoric sharpened his voice. Law sharpened his reasoning. Military theory prepared him for conflicts he hoped would never come. Every lesson carried an unspoken message. You are being shaped, not for happiness, for function. And Marcus complied. But compliance did not mean acceptance. At night, after the tutors left and the palace grew quiet, Marcus returned to philosophy, not as escape, but as armor. He gravitated toward Stoicism, not because it was fashionable, but because it spoke to his deepest fear, losing control of himself. Stoicism taught him that external events were indifferent, that power, wealth, reputation, even the throne itself were not good or evil. Only how one used them mattered. This idea became a lifeline. If he could not escape destiny, perhaps he could at least remain internally untouched by it. Still, adoption changed everything. His name was altered, his clothes became finer. His public presence was choreographed. He was displayed at ceremonies, seated carefully, observed constantly. People bowed now, not to him, but to what he represented. This unsettled him. Marcus noticed how quickly behavior changed around power. Friends became cautious. Compliments became exaggerated. Silence grew strategic. He learned early that truth rarely travels upward. This realization lodged itself deep within him and never left. To counteract it, Marcus cultivated an almost obsessive self-scrutiny. He wrote reminders to himself, mental notes, rules of conduct. Do not enjoy flattery. Do not punish anger with anger. Do not confuse obedience with respect. He was preparing not to rule, but to survive ruling. Years passed quietly under Antoninus Pius's reign. Rome prospered. The borders held. The Senate cooperated. To many, this was a golden age. But Marcus felt no ease. Comfort, he believed, was a dangerous teacher. It taught people to forget that everything breaks. Antoninus, sensing Marcus's nature, did not force him into premature authority. Instead, he allowed him to mature slowly. This restraint was unusual and profoundly influential. Marcus learned patience not from theory, but from observation, from watching a man who ruled by consistency rather than fear. Yet even in this calm, Marcus sensed the storm gathering beyond the horizon. The empire was vast, its peace fragile. And Marcus, despite all efforts to resist it, was moving closer to the center of gravity. He was made consul while still young. Honors accumulated like dust he could not shake off. Each promotion tightened the net. Each ceremony reinforced the narrative. This is who you are becoming. Marcus watched himself being transformed in the eyes of others and feared that one day he might start believing it too. So he clung harder to philosophy. He reminded himself that emperors died like everyone else, that statues crumbled, that names faded. He trained his mind to imagine the throne already gone, the empire already dissolved, so that he would not cling to them when they were placed in his hands. This was not morbid. It was defensive. The most dangerous moment, Marcus believed, was not when power was taken, but when it was enjoyed. As Antoninus aged, the future grew unavoidable. Marcus could feel it approaching like a long shadow at sunset. He did not rush toward it. He did not flee. He stood still, disciplined, watchful, bracing himself. Adopted by destiny, shaped by patience, armored by philosophy, Marcus Aurelius was becoming something rare and fragile. A ruler who never forgot that the throne was temporary. And soon, very soon, it would be his. The empire would test whether a man who did not desire power could bear it longer than those who did. And the philosopher would discover that preparation, no matter how rigorous, cannot fully soften the moment when the world finally places its weight upon your shoulders. That moment is coming, and when it arrives, the golden cage will close, slowly, quietly, without asking whether he is ready. The palace was beautiful in the way storms are beautiful, impressive, commanding, and dangerous if you lingered too long without protection. By the time Marcus Aurelius reached full maturity, luxury had become unavoidable. Silks, servants, polished stone, endless corridors echoing with controlled voices. Rome called this success. Marcus called it exposure. Every comfort threatened to dull his vigilance. Every privilege risked softening the discipline he had worked so hard to build. So he fought it quietly. He dressed simply whenever protocol allowed. He ate modestly. He rejected excess not as a performance, but as an act of self-defense. Marcus understood something that few in power ever admit. Indulgence is not a reward. It is erosion. It blurs the line between need and desire, until even injustice feels reasonable. Philosophy became his refuge, but also his restraint. Stoicism, especially, spoke to him with a severity that felt honest. It did not promise happiness. It promised clarity. It did not offer escape from suffering, only the tools to endure it without surrendering integrity. Marcus read the words of Epictetus again and again, absorbing the idea that no one could truly harm him unless he allowed them to corrupt his judgment. This idea settled into his bones. He began to structure his entire inner life around one principle: control what is yours to control and release everything else. The empire, not his; reputation, not his; even his body, temporary. Only his thoughts, his judgments, belonged to him. And yet, the cage was closing. Public life demanded performance. Marcus was expected to speak with confidence, to embody certainty, to reassure an empire that needed symbols more than truth. Each appearance felt like a small betrayal, not of Rome, but of himself. He feared becoming a mask that eventually fused to his face, so he practiced vigilance. He observed his reactions as if they belonged to someone else. When praised, he reminded himself how easily praise rots the soul. When criticized, he examined whether the criticism was deserved before allowing emotion to respond. He treated his own mind as a battlefield, one that required constant patrol. This self-surveillance was exhausting, but necessary. Because Marcus knew what history did to powerful men, he studied past emperors not for inspiration, but for warnings. He saw how absolute authority magnified small vices into public disasters, how impatience became cruelty, how insecurity became paranoia, how ego became policy. These were not anomalies. They were patterns. Marcus feared becoming a pattern. The golden cage was not just material, it was psychological. Every choice he made carried consequences for millions. This knowledge infiltrated his sleep, his thoughts, his silences. He felt watched not only by courtiers and senators, but by history itself. And history, he knew, was unforgiving. To survive this pressure, Marcus developed a radical intimacy with himself. He began writing private reflections, not polished philosophy, not literature, but raw instructions, commands whispered inwardly, reminders to stay human. Do not be swept away by anger. Do not seek comfort in dominance. Do not forget how fragile you are. These writings were not meant to be read. They were shields forged in secrecy. Still, doubt lingered. Marcus often wondered whether philosophy itself could survive contact with real power. It was one thing to discuss virtue in a lecture hall, another to practice it while commanding armies, passing laws, and deciding who lived or died. This question haunted him. He watched as lesser officials compromised easily, watched how good intentions bent under pressure. watched how necessity was used as an excuse for brutality. And each time he asked himself, would I do better? Or would I simply justify it more elegantly? The answer terrified him. Antoninus Pius remained a steady presence, but age was slowly dimming him. The calm of his reign felt like borrowed time. Beyond the palace walls, tensions were rising. Borders strained. The illusion of eternal peace began to crack. Marcus sensed that philosophy would soon be tested not in thought, but in fire. Yet even now, he resisted attachment to the future. He trained himself to imagine losing everything he had before it was taken. This was not pessimism. It was preparation. By rehearsing loss, he hoped to reduce its power over him. He reflected often on death, not morbidly, but honestly. Death, he believed, was the great equalizer, the reminder that emperors and servants dissolve the same way. Remembering this kept his ego in check, and yet, for all his preparation, something essential remained unresolved. Marcus Aurelius did not trust himself with power. This was the secret tension at the core of his being. Not fear of enemies, not fear of failure, but fear of internal decay, fear that comfort would make him careless, that authority would make him deaf, that necessity would make him cruel. The golden cage was not locking him in, it was tempting him to forget it existed. As Antoninus's health declined, the final barrier thinned. Marcus could feel the shift in how people looked at him, less as a student, more as a sovereign. Their expectations pressed closer. Their hopes grew heavier. The philosopher was running out of time. Soon, there would be no buffer, no mentor absorbing the pressure, no rehearsal. Soon, the cage would no longer be symbolic. It would be absolute. And Marcus Aurelius, armed only with discipline and doubt, would discover whether a man who despised power could wield it without being consumed. That moment approaches now. The calm before the weight, the silence before the world asks its question and demands an answer. The transition did not arrive with thunder. There were no riots in the streets, no sudden collapse, no dramatic omen tearing the sky open. When Antoninus Pius finally died, Rome continued breathing as it always had, slowly, habitually, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. For Marcus Aurelius, this quiet was unbearable. He had spent years preparing for this moment in theory, training his mind, stripping away illusions, rehearsing loss. But nothing in philosophy could fully prepare him for the instant when preparation ended and responsibility became irreversible. One moment, he was a student of restraint. The next, he was emperor of Rome. The Senate confirmed his authority swiftly. The rituals unfolded with mechanical precision. Titles were spoken aloud. Oaths were sworn. Symbols exchanged hands. The machinery of empire accepted him without hesitation. Marcus felt none of its confidence. What he felt instead was pressure. Immense, silent, unrelenting. Not excitement, not pride. Weight, as if the world had leaned forward and placed itself squarely on his chest. Rome expected certainty. Marcus felt uncertainty sharpen into awareness. He insisted on something unprecedented. He would not rule alone. He elevated Lucius Verus as co-emperor, sharing authority rather than concentrating it. To many, this seemed generous. To Marcus, it was defensive. Power divided, he believed, was power less likely to corrupt. Already, he was resisting the throne. But resistance could not slow reality. Almost immediately, crises emerged as if summoned by his ascension. To the east, the Parthian Empire tested Rome's borders. To the north, Germanic tribes stirred. Inside the empire, disease moved silently, carried by soldiers and merchants alike. The world Marcus inherited was not stable. It was waiting, and now it waited for him. He responded not with bravado, but with relentless effort. Marcus worked longer hours than anyone around him. He listened carefully. He reviewed details personally. He refused to delegate blindly. He knew that mistakes made at this level did not remain mistakes. They became suffering. Still, doubt followed him everywhere. In public, he projected calm. In private, his thoughts churned. Was he strong enough? Was he decisive enough? Would mercy be mistaken for weakness? Would firmness slide into cruelty? Every decision felt like a moral trap. War forced his hand early. Lucius Verus was sent east to command armies, while Marcus remained in Rome, managing logistics, politics, and the slow realization that peace was no longer a default condition. Marcus hated war, not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. War, he knew, stripped away pretense and revealed what leaders truly valued. He feared what it might reveal in him. As reports arrived, casualties, delays, miscalculations, Marcus read them alone, often late at night. He imagined the faces behind the numbers, the families, the absence that would ripple outward long after the parchment was filed away. This awareness isolated him. People around him sought reassurance. Marcus offered steadiness, not comfort. He understood that an emperor's fear, once visible, multiplies. So he contained it, folded it inward, where it pressed against his ribs. Then came the plague. It did not announce itself. It crept. Soldiers returning from the east brought it with them. At first, it was whispers, fevers, then bodies, then entire districts emptied. Rome, which believed itself eternal, was reminded how easily flesh yields. Marcus watched the empire weaken not through invasion, but through vulnerability. He did not flee. He did not hide behind walls. He organized relief, reallocated resources, and sold imperial luxuries to fund aid. Statues, treasures, symbols of permanence were exchanged for temporary survival. Power, he decided, was only meaningful if it alleviated suffering. And yet, suffering did not stop. The weight of leadership grew heavier with every passing month. Marcus slept little. When he did sleep, his dreams were crowded, with decisions, with faces, with unfinished thoughts. He began writing more urgently now, not elegantly, not philosophically, but practically. Do not be angry at what you cannot control. Do not let exhaustion make you unjust. Remember that you are mortal. These were not slogans. They were warnings. The Senate deferred to him. The people watched him. The army depended on him. And Marcus, who had once feared the corruption of power, now feared something else just as much, failing to use it when necessary. This was the cruel paradox of authority. Restraint could be virtue or negligence. Action could be justice or violence. The line between them shifted constantly, and Marcus alone was expected to see it clearly. He questioned himself relentlessly. Too relentlessly, some might say. But Marcus believed that unchecked certainty was more dangerous than doubt. As the years passed, the initial shock of rule did not fade. It settled. The weight did not lift. It became part of him. He learned to carry it, but never to forget it was there. This was not a reign of glory. It was a reign of endurance. And in the quiet moments, those rare slivers of stillness between disasters, Marcus felt the full irony of his fate. The man who had spent his youth preparing to resist power now possessed more of it than anyone alive. And still, he did not trust it. The world had fallen on his shoulders, and it was not going to climb off. What Marcus did next would not be written for applause. It would be written in private, line by line, thought by thought, in the dark hours when even emperors are alone with themselves. That is where his true legacy begins, in words not meant to survive, in a voice meant only to steady a soul under pressure, and in the quiet realization that ruling the world was easier than ruling the self. Night was the only time Marcus Aurelius belonged to himself. When the lamps dimmed and the palace corridors emptied, the emperor slipped out of the role the world demanded of him. No senate, no generals, no petitioners waiting with practiced urgency. Only a man, awake, surrounded by silence, heavy enough to press against the chest. This was when he wrote. Not proclamations, not speeches, not philosophy meant to impress. What Marcus put to paper during these hours was something far more dangerous. Honest thought. Words stripped of performance. Sentences that existed not to persuade others, but to restrain himself. He never intended these writings to be read. That fact changes everything. Because when no audience exists, there is no incentive to lie. Marcus wrote as one might speak to a failing friend. Stern, patient, uncompromising. He scolded himself for vanity. He warned himself against anger. He reminded himself that power was not proof of worth, and obedience was not evidence of truth. Again and again he returned to the same fear, that the throne would teach him to enjoy being obeyed. This, to Marcus, was the most corrupting pleasure imaginable. He wrote reminders against it, as if carving grooves into his own mind. Do not become Caesar in spirit. Do not let your position harden you. Do not confuse control with wisdom. These were not abstract concerns. They were daily battles. Because every day, the empire reinforced the illusion that his judgment was superior by default. Marcus fought that illusion relentlessly. He told himself that people were not evil when they disappointed him, only ignorant, mistaken, or afraid. This belief did not excuse harm, but it prevented hatred. Hatred, he believed, was a luxury no ruler could afford without losing clarity. Still, anger crept in, when officials lied, when generals failed, when disasters struck without explanation. Marcus felt frustration rise like heat, and each time he addressed it directly in his writing, not with self-pity, but with instruction. You knew this would happen. You were not promised ease. Respond as you trained yourself to respond. These were not comforting words. They were stabilizing ones. Marcus returned constantly to the idea of impermanence. He reminded himself that everything around him, palace, empire, reputation, was already in the process of dissolving. This was not despair. It was grounding. If nothing lasted, then nothing deserved worship, especially not power. He wrote of death often, but not morbidly. Death, for Marcus, was the ultimate equalizer. The reminder that emperors rot the same as beggars. Remembering this protected him from arrogance. Forgetting it, he believed, destroyed rulers. And yet, these writings also reveal vulnerability. There are moments where Marcus admits exhaustion, moments where he feels surrounded by incompetence, moments where he wonders whether anyone truly understands the burden he carries. These lines are rare, but they matter. They show that beneath the discipline was a man struggling not to collapse under isolation. The paradox of leadership haunted him. The higher he rose, the fewer honest voices remained around him. Everyone wanted something. Everyone filtered their words. Even kindness felt strategic. Marcus learned that solitude was not the absence of people, but it was the absence of truth. So he turned inward. The pages became his only space of complete honesty, a place where he could admit fear without weakening authority, where he could confess doubt without destabilizing the empire, where he could speak freely to the only person who could not betray him, himself. These writings were repetitive, intentionally so. Marcus knew the mind forgets its discipline under pressure, so he repeated his principles the way soldiers repeated drills. The repetition was not a flaw. It was evidence of constant resistance. He was not writing to discover wisdom. He was writing to remember it. The tone of these pages is strikingly unromantic. There is no grandeur, no myth-making, just reminders to do one's duty, to remain fair, to endure discomfort without complaint. Marcus did not aspire to greatness. He aspired to consistency. This is what makes the writings unsettling. Because they expose how fragile virtue feels when tested daily by absolute power. Marcus knew that good intentions decayed without maintenance. He treated his character like a structure that required constant reinforcement. Neglect it, and it would collapse under the weight of command. The empire slept while he wrote. Outside, guards stood motionless. Fires burned low. Somewhere, citizens dreamed of tomorrow without knowing the thoughts of the man who shaped it. Marcus wrote, knowing none of this would ever matter to history. And that was the point. These were not words meant to survive. They were words meant to save him from cruelty disguised as necessity, save him from pride disguised as confidence, save him from becoming what Rome had taught the world to expect from its emperors. Ironically, it is these private words, never meant for us, that became his most enduring legacy, not because they reveal perfection, but because they reveal resistance. A man in absolute power fighting to remain internally free. A ruler who understood that the most dangerous tyranny is not imposed on others, but exercised over one's own conscience. As the nights passed and the crises multiplied, Marcus continued writing, line after line, thought after thought, each one a quiet act of defiance against the throne he could not escape. Because even as emperor, Marcus Aurelius believed something deeply subversive, that the highest form of power is the ability to remain just, when injustice would be easier. And the hardest battle he would ever fight was not against Rome's enemies. It was against the slow, seductive voice inside him that whispered, "You deserve this." The writing was his answer, and it kept him awake. While the world slept, night was the only time Marcus Aurelius belonged to himself. When the lamps dimmed and the palace corridors emptied, the emperor slipped out of the role the world demanded of him. No senate, no generals, no petitioners waiting with practiced urgency. Only a man, awake, surrounded by silence, heavy enough to press against the chest. This was when he wrote. Not proclamations, not speeches, not philosophy meant to impress. What Marcus put to paper during these hours was something far more dangerous. Honest thought. Words stripped of performance. Sentences that existed not to persuade others, but to restrain himself. He never intended these writings to be read. That fact changes everything. Because when no audience exists, there is no incentive to lie. Marcus wrote as one might speak to a failing friend. Stern, patient, uncompromising. He scolded himself for vanity. He warned himself against anger. He reminded himself that power was not proof of worth, and obedience was not evidence of truth. Again and again he returned to the same fear, that the throne would teach him to enjoy being obeyed. This, to Marcus, was the most corrupting pleasure imaginable. He wrote reminders against it as if carving grooves into his own mind. Do not become Caesar in spirit. Do not let your position harden you. Do not confuse control with wisdom. These were not abstract concerns. They were daily battles. Because every day, the empire reinforced the illusion that his judgment was superior by default. Marcus fought that illusion relentlessly. He told himself that people were not evil when they disappointed him, only ignorant, mistaken, or afraid. This belief did not excuse harm, but it prevented hatred. Hatred, he believed, was a luxury no ruler could afford without losing clarity. Still, anger crept in, when officials lied, when generals failed, when disasters struck without explanation. Marcus felt frustration rise like heat, and each time he addressed it directly in his writing, not with self-pity, but with instruction. You knew this would happen. You were not promised ease. Respond as you trained yourself to respond. These were not comforting words. They were stabilizing ones. Marcus returned constantly to the idea of impermanence. He reminded himself that everything around him, palace, empire, reputation, was already in the process of dissolving. This was not despair. It was grounding. If nothing lasted, then nothing deserved worship, especially not power. He wrote of death often, but not morbidly. Death, for Marcus, was the ultimate equalizer, the reminder that emperors rot the same as beggars. Remembering this protected him from arrogance. Forgetting it, he believed, destroyed rulers. And yet, these writings also reveal vulnerability. There are moments where Marcus admits exhaustion, moments where he feels surrounded by incompetence, moments where he wonders whether anyone truly understands the burden he carries. These lines are rare, but they matter. They show that beneath the discipline was a man struggling not to collapse under isolation. The paradox of leadership haunted him. The higher he rose, the fewer honest voices remained around him. Everyone wanted something. Everyone filtered their words. Even kindness felt strategic. Marcus learned that solitude was not the absence of people, but it was the absence of truth. So he turned inward. The pages became his only space of complete honesty, a place where he could admit fear without weakening authority, where he could confess doubt without destabilizing the empire, where he could speak freely to the only person who could not betray him, himself. These writings were repetitive, intentionally so. Marcus knew the mind forgets its discipline under pressure, so he repeated his principles the way soldiers repeated drills. The repetition was not a flaw. It was evidence of constant resistance. He was not writing to discover wisdom. He was writing to remember it. The tone of these pages is strikingly unromantic. There is no grandeur, no myth-making, just reminders to do one's duty, to remain fair, to endure discomfort without complaint. Marcus did not aspire to greatness. He aspired to consistency. This is what makes the writings unsettling. Because they expose how fragile virtue feels when tested daily by absolute power. Marcus knew that good intentions decayed without maintenance. He treated his character like a structure that required constant reinforcement. Neglect it, and it would collapse under the weight of command. The empire slept while he wrote. Outside, guards stood motionless. Fires burned low. Somewhere, citizens dreamed of tomorrow without knowing the thoughts of the man who shaped it. Marcus wrote, knowing none of this would ever matter to history. And that was the point. These were not words meant to survive. They were words meant to save him from cruelty disguised as necessity. Save him from pride disguised as confidence. Save him from becoming what Rome had taught the world to expect from its emperors. Ironically, it is these private words, never meant for us, that became his most enduring legacy, not because they reveal perfection, but because they reveal resistance. A man in absolute power fighting to remain internally free. A ruler who understood that the most dangerous tyranny is not imposed on others, but exercised over one's own conscience. As the nights passed and the crises multiplied, Marcus continued writing, line after line, thought after thought, each one a quiet act of defiance against the throne he could not escape. Because even as emperor, Marcus Aurelius believed something deeply subversive, that the highest form of power is the ability to remain just, when injustice would be easier. And the hardest battle he would ever fight was not against Rome's enemies. It was against the slow, seductive voice inside him that whispered, "You deserve this." The writing was his answer, and it kept him awake. While the world slept, war arrived not as a single event, but as a gradual tightening of the world. Borders that had held for generations began to tremble. Treaties frayed. Movements of people became movements of threat. Along the northern frontiers, beyond the rivers and forests Rome barely understood, pressure mounted like a storm that refused to break. Marcus Aurelius had spent his life preparing for moral struggle. Now history demanded something far more brutal. He did not romanticize war. He never had. To Marcus, war was failure made visible, a sign that reason had reached its limit. Yet as emperor, he was forced to confront an unforgiving truth. Refusing to fight did not prevent violence. It only changed who suffered first. And so, reluctantly, he went to the front. The emperor in armor unsettled those who saw him. He did not radiate conquest. He radiated gravity. Marcus moved through the camps without spectacle, observing more than commanding, listening more than boasting. Soldiers expected speeches of glory. What they received instead was presence. Quiet, watchful, unflinching. Marcus believed that if war must be waged, it should be done without illusion. He studied reports meticulously, supply lines, morale, weather. He understood that strategy was not abstract. It was lived reality. A delayed shipment meant hunger. A misjudged march meant death. These were not numbers. They were consequences. Still, violence repelled him. Marcus struggled with the contradiction of ordering deaths while preaching inner peace. Stoicism did not absolve him of responsibility. It sharpened it. He did not tell himself that the slain were insignificant. He reminded himself that they were human, and that killing them, even in defense, was tragic. This awareness made command heavier, but also more careful. He forbade unnecessary cruelty. He punished looting. He insisted on discipline not as dominance, but as restraint. The army was not a beast to be unleashed. It was a tool to be controlled. This approach confused some commanders. They were used to emperors who sought victory for glory. Marcus sought it for stability. He did not desire annihilation. He wanted borders secured, civilians protected, and violence contained as tightly as possible. But war resists containment. The northern campaigns were brutal. Winters froze flesh and morale alike. Soldiers died not only from blades, but from cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Marcus endured these conditions alongside them, not as performance, but as solidarity. He slept on the ground. He shared the hardship, not because it made him loved, but because it felt dishonest not to. At night, in military tents lit by flickering oil lamps, he returned to writing. These were the hardest pages. Here, Marcus confronted his darkest emotions: rage at betrayal, weariness from endless struggle, grief that could not be publicly expressed. He reminded himself not to hate the enemy, not because they were innocent, but because hatred corrupted judgment. Hate, he believed, made cruelty feel justified, and cruelty, once justified, became habit. So he fought without hatred. This did not mean weakness. Rome's enemies learned quickly that restraint did not equal hesitation. Marcus authorized decisive action when necessary. He understood that mercy without strength invites chaos, but strength without mercy invites something worse. The line between the two tormented him. Every decision echoed, every order lingered. Marcus knew that the faces of the dead would never look back at him, but the knowledge of their deaths would. He did not numb himself to this. Instead, he absorbed it. This was his burden: to carry awareness without paralysis, to act decisively without becoming callous, to remain humane while commanding an inhumane machine. Many nights, the weight nearly broke him. He wrote reminders against despair, against bitterness, against the temptation to retreat into emotional distance. Do not become stone, he warned himself. Do not let necessity hollow you out. The army respected him, not because he inspired awe, but because he inspired trust. They saw that he did not gamble their lives casually, that he did not seek personal glory, that he remained with them when others might have delegated suffering. This respect was earned slowly, quietly. Marcus did not want to be loved by the army. He wanted to be worthy of their obedience. As years passed, the wars dragged on. There were victories. There were setbacks. There was no clean ending, only endurance, only continuation. Marcus learned that war did not test courage as much as patience, and patience, stretched too far, became sorrow. Still, he persisted. He reminded himself that the purpose of his role was not happiness, but function, that wishing for a different life did not absolve him of the one he had. That resistance to fate did not change fate, but resistance to corruption still mattered. So he continued, commanding without cruelty, deciding without hatred, enduring without surrendering his inner compass. The philosopher did not become a conqueror. He became something rarer, a ruler who never forgot the cost of what he ordered. And yet, as the wars consumed years of his life, another realization began to surface. Slowly, unavoidably. Even the most disciplined mind cannot fully escape isolation. The more Marcus gave of himself to the empire, the less remained for personal connection. And in that growing silence, a different kind of struggle awaited him. Not on the battlefield, but within the walls of his own life. The war outside would eventually quiet. The war inside was just beginning. Power does not announce its isolation. It arrives disguised as attention, as respect, as deference. People listen more carefully. Rooms fall silent when you enter. Faces turn toward you with practiced seriousness. At first, it feels like importance. Then, slowly, it reveals itself as distance. Marcus Aurelius felt this distance growing year by year. The higher he rose, the fewer unguarded voices remained around him. Conversations shortened, laughter softened. Disagreement became rare, and when it did appear, it was carefully wrapped in courtesy. Marcus learned that people no longer spoke to him. They spoke around him. This was the cost of command. Friends became cautious. Advisors became filtered. Even affection felt conditional. Everyone knew that his favor could change lives, and so sincerity became risky. Marcus, who valued truth above comfort, found himself surrounded by careful performances. It was suffocating. He missed simplicity. He missed being corrected without ceremony. He missed the honest friction of equals, but equality cannot coexist easily with absolute power, and Marcus knew this too well to resent it openly, so he endured it quietly. The loneliness of leadership was not merely social, it was emotional. Marcus carried burdens he could not share, decisions whose consequences could not be discussed without destabilizing those around him. Doubts that, if voiced, would echo as weakness. Even empathy became dangerous. To grieve openly was to unsettle. To hesitate publicly was to invite doubt. Marcus learned to absorb pain silently, like a vessel designed to hold more than it should. And the pain was not only political. His personal life fractured repeatedly. Children were born and buried. Loss became routine, never easier, only more familiar. Marcus grieved as a father, not as an emperor, but he grieved alone. There were no rituals for this kind of mourning, no public acknowledgement. The empire did not pause for personal sorrow, so Marcus folded grief inward, adding it to the growing weight he carried. He wrote about this too, but obliquely. Stoicism did not encourage emotional indulgence, but it did not deny pain either. Marcus allowed himself to feel loss, then reminded himself that nothing given by fate comes with permanence. This did not erase sorrow. It contextualized it. Still, isolation deepened. Even his marriage, stable by political standards, could not bridge the distance created by responsibility. Marcus loved his family, but the demands of rule fractured time and presence. Duty intruded constantly. There was always another crisis, another frontier, another report demanding attention. And then there was Commodus. Marcus's son was everything he feared, and everything he loved. Where Marcus was disciplined, Commodus was indulgent. Where Marcus restrained himself, Commodus reached outward. The contrast was painful. Marcus tried to guide him, to teach through example, to instill restraint, humility, awareness. But he knew, perhaps too clearly, that virtue cannot be forced. Character cannot be imposed by authority. This realization haunted him. If he could not shape his own son, what did that say about his belief in philosophy as a stabilizing force? If wisdom could not be transmitted through power, then what hope did the empire have? These doubts grew heavier with age. The more Marcus reflected, the more he understood the cruelty of his position. He could shape laws, armies, and borders, but not souls. And yet, history would judge him by outcomes he could not fully control. This awareness sharpened his solitude. He began withdrawing emotionally, not from bitterness, but from necessity. He conserved energy. He focused inward. The writings became more frequent, more urgent. Reminders turned sharper. Do not expect understanding. Do not require gratitude. Do not confuse solitude with injustice. Marcus was not bitter, but he was alone. The army trusted him. The Senate respected him. The people admired him. But admiration is not companionship. Respect is not intimacy. And authority creates walls that even the kindest ruler cannot dismantle. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Marcus felt the full weight of this isolation pressed down. Nights when the silence was too complete, when the absence of honest voices echoed louder than any crowd. In those moments, he reminded himself why he endured. He did not rule to be loved. He ruled to prevent chaos. This belief sustained him. Yet beneath the discipline, beneath the acceptance, there lingered a quiet sadness. Not despair, but recognition. Recognition that the role he played required personal sacrifice that no one would ever fully see. the emperor, surrounded by millions, was fundamentally alone. And perhaps this was the final test of power, not whether one could wield it, but whether one could endure its emptiness without becoming resentful. Marcus Aurelius endured. He did not lash out. He did not retreat into cruelty. He did not demand affection he could not receive. Instead, he refined his inner life. If the outer world could not offer companionship, he would cultivate clarity. If honesty could not reach him from others, he would demand it from himself. This was not resignation, it was adaptation. And as the years pressed on, Marcus began to sense another truth, one even more unsettling than isolation. That control itself was an illusion. That no matter how carefully he governed, no matter how disciplined his mind, there were forces beyond reach. Illness, betrayal, time. And soon, the philosopher-emperor would confront the final paradox of his life: how to let go while still holding everything together. That reckoning is coming, slowly, inevitably. And it will strip even power of its last pretense. Marcus Aurelius had spent a lifetime learning how to command. Now, he was learning something far more difficult: how to release. Control had always been the unspoken promise of power, that if one rose high enough, planned carefully enough, ruled wisely enough, the world could be shaped into order. That chaos could be minimized, that suffering could be managed, that fate itself might bend. Marcus knew better. Years of rule had stripped away that illusion piece by piece. Every success revealed a new vulnerability. Every solution uncovered another problem. The empire functioned not because it was controlled, but because it was constantly collapsing and being held together again. This realization unsettled him deeply, not because it surprised him, but because it demanded a shift. Even philosophy could not fully soften. Stoicism taught acceptance of what lay beyond control. But living that acceptance while holding absolute authority was a different matter entirely. Marcus felt the tension daily. He could command armies, but not outcomes. He could pass laws, but not ensure justice. He could discipline officials, but not prevent corruption. He could rule an empire, but not his own aging body. Illness began to visit him more often now. Subtle at first: fatigue, pain that lingered longer than it used to, sleep that refused to restore him fully. Marcus observed these changes with the same unsparing attention he gave to political matters. The body, he reminded himself, is borrowed. Still, the loss of physical resilience unsettled him, not because he feared death, but because weakness limited his capacity to act. And action, even reluctant action, had become his duty. This was the paradox of his position. He believed deeply in surrender to fate, yet could not surrender responsibility. So he learned a finer distinction between what must be done and what must be released. Marcus began practicing this separation deliberately. He acted decisively where action was required, then refused to emotionally cling to outcomes. This was not indifference, it was discipline. Once a decision was made, he let it go. The alternative, he knew, was madness. He saw it in others. Officials obsessed with legacy, generals consumed by pride, senators paralyzed by fear of appearing wrong. They tried to control perception, memory, history itself, and in doing so, they lost clarity. Marcus refused that trap. He reminded himself that even reputation was external, that praise and blame belonged to others, that history would interpret his reign without his consent. Accepting this freed him, not from judgment, but from dependence on it. And yet, the most painful loss of control came closer to home. Commodus grew older. Despite Marcus's efforts, despite instruction and example, his son gravitated toward excess. Marcus observed this with a mixture of sorrow and restraint. He resisted the urge to dominate his son's character the way he dominated policy. He knew that coercion breeds resentment, not wisdom. This was perhaps his hardest lesson. That authority ends where the inner life begins. Marcus could not force virtue into another soul, not even his heir. This realization hollowed him in ways no battlefield ever had. It exposed the limits of even the most disciplined mind. And yet, he did not rage against it. He acknowledged the truth quietly. He wrote about it indirectly, about nature following its course, about seeds growing according to their own design, about the futility of wishing the world to be other than it is. These metaphors were not abstractions. They were confessions. The more Marcus released his grip, the more clearly he saw. Power, he concluded, was not the ability to impose will, but the capacity to respond rightly to what could not be changed. This redefinition did not make him weaker. It made him precise. He conserved energy. He simplified decisions. He focused on essentials. As the empire strained under constant pressure, Marcus became more inwardly still. This calm unsettled those around him. Some mistook it for detachment, others for coldness. Few understood that it was the product of relentless inner labor. Marcus was not withdrawing. He was concentrating. He accepted that he could not fix everything. He accepted that mistakes would outlive him. He accepted that suffering would continue despite his efforts. And still, he acted. Not because he believed in control, but because he believed in responsibility. This distinction defined him. As his health declined further, Marcus began preparing not for victory, but for departure. Not publicly, not ceremonially, internally. He rehearsed letting go of identity, title, even memory. I am not my position. I am not my body. I am not my reputation. These were not comforting affirmations. They were rehearsals for disappearance. He knew death was approaching, not as threat, but as certainty. And in this certainty, he found a strange clarity. The noise of ambition faded. The weight of legacy loosened. What remained was simplicity. Do what must be done. Accept what must be endured. Release what cannot be held. This was the paradox resolved, not through domination, but through surrender without abandonment of duty. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, had reached the edge of control. Beyond it lay something quieter and closer than ever. The end was not yet here, but it was close enough to feel. And when it arrived, it would ask only one thing of him, not strength, not brilliance, not power, but consent. The final chapter is coming, and with it, the moment when the man who never wanted power finally lays it down. There is a particular kind of fear reserved for parents who understand the world too well. Marcus Aurelius had spent a lifetime studying human nature, its weaknesses, its vanities, its hunger for excess. He had governed men who mistook indulgence for entitlement and authority for divinity. He had restrained them with law, reason, and force when necessary. But when it came to his son, none of that certainty remained. Commodus was not cruel as a child. He was charming, charismatic, energetic in ways Marcus had never been. Where Marcus turned inward, Commodus reached outward. Where Marcus disciplined desire, Commodus embraced it. These differences were not faults in youth, but Marcus recognized their trajectory. and it frightened him. The philosopher-emperor believed deeply in moral education through example. He modeled restraint, humility, and endurance. He exposed Commodus to philosophy, to governance, to the realities of power. He brought him into the public eye early, hoping familiarity would dull temptation rather than sharpen it. But the empire whispered a different lesson. Commodus grew up surrounded by luxury without the hunger that had taught Marcus discipline. He was praised without earning it, obeyed without proving wisdom, shielded from consequence by proximity to power. Marcus saw the danger clearly. Privilege without internal restraint, he believed, was the most unstable foundation imaginable. He tried reason. He tried patience. He tried philosophy. He reminded Commodus, gently, that power was service, not reward, that the throne was a burden, not a toy, that domination without self-mastery led only to ruin. Commodus listened, and then he forgot. This was the philosopher's deepest wound, not because his son disobeyed, but because Marcus recognized the pattern. He had seen it before in other rulers. He knew how it ended. And yet, he did not remove Commodus from succession. This decision has puzzled historians for centuries. Why would a man so deeply aware of power's dangers entrust it to someone so visibly vulnerable to them? The answer lies not in blindness, but in limitation. Marcus understood something most critics ignore. Empire does not allow perfect choices. Removing Commodus would have required civil war, betrayal, bloodshed, on a scale Marcus found morally intolerable. To preserve stability, he accepted personal tragedy. This was not weakness. It was sacrifice. Marcus chose continuity over idealism, knowing the cost would be paid after his death. He did not delude himself. His writings grow darker in these final years, not with anger, but with resignation. Do not demand that what follows you be worthy. Be worthy yourself while you can. This belief guided him. Still, the pain remained. To watch one's life's work unravel in advance is a unique kind of suffering. Marcus saw his philosophies strained not by enemies, but by inheritance. The empire he had held together through discipline would soon be placed in hands he could no longer guide. This knowledge isolated him further. There was no one he could confess this fear to openly. To doubt his own successor publicly would destabilize everything. So Marcus held the knowledge in silence. He reminded himself that outcomes were never fully ours to claim. The role of a good man, he believed, was not to guarantee the future, but to act rightly in the present. This belief allowed him to breathe. He spent more time reflecting, less time persuading. His energy waned. His focus narrowed. He prepared the empire as best he could, not for perfection, but for survival. He taught Commodus what he could, knowing it might not be enough. And then he stopped trying to control what could not be controlled. This was perhaps his final philosophical victory: to love without illusion, to hope without attachment, to release without bitterness. Marcus Aurelius faced the most personal failure of his life with the same discipline he had brought to war and governance. He did not justify it. He did not dramatize it. He accepted it. History would judge Commodus. Marcus judged himself and found only one standard worth applying: whether he had remained faithful to his principles despite inevitable disappointment. By that measure, he did not waver. The philosopher had done all he could. Now, only one task remained: to meet the end, not as an emperor clinging to relevance, but as a man ready to disappear. The final surrender approaches, quietly, inevitably. And when it comes, Marcus Aurelius will not resist it. He will welcome it, as the last thing he does not need to control. The end did not arrive in Rome. It came far from marble halls and ceremonial echoes on the edge of the empire, where the air was colder and the world felt unfinished. Marcus Aurelius lay in a military camp, surrounded not by splendor, but by canvas, wood, and the muted sounds of soldiers moving carefully outside his tent. It was fitting. He had spent much of his reign here, between worlds, between civilization and chaos, between duty and reflection, between holding on and learning how to release. His body was failing now in ways no discipline could override. Fever weakened him. Pain visited without warning. Even sitting upright demanded effort. Marcus observed these changes without panic. He had rehearsed this moment in thought for decades. The body obeys nature. The mind must follow. He knew the signs. This was not a battle to be won. Advisors and physicians came and went, their faces guarded. They spoke carefully, avoiding finality. Marcus did not need their reassurance. He had already accepted what was coming. Not with resignation, but with clarity. There was no bitterness left in him. He did not rage against fate. He did not demand more time. He did not cling to unfinished plans. The empire, vast and turbulent, would continue without him, as it always would have. This knowledge brought relief. In his final days, Marcus spoke little, not because he had nothing to say, but because words felt unnecessary now. He had already said everything that mattered, even if no one had heard it. His thoughts turned inward. He reflected not on victories, but on conduct. Not on expansion, but on restraint. He asked himself only one question. Had he ruled in a way that allowed him to leave without regret? The answer, imperfect as it was, felt sufficient. He gave final instructions calmly. There was no grand farewell, no dramatic last stand, just quiet arrangements, the continuation of routine, the preservation of order. Marcus did not seek to shape how he would be remembered. Legacy, he believed, was not something one could command. And then came the final act of letting go. He dismissed those closest to him, asked to be left alone. Not out of coldness, but out of honesty. Death, like power, was something each person faced alone. As the tent quieted, Marcus Aurelius turned inward one last time. He reminded himself that everything he had been given, life, breath, authority, was temporary by design. That returning them was not loss, but completion. He did not fear non-existence. He had spent his life practicing for it. The emperor who had commanded legions now commanded nothing, not even his breath, and in this surrender there was no humiliation, only alignment. Alignment with nature, alignment with reason, alignment with the truth he had lived by. When death came, it was not dramatic, it was gentle, a final release. The world did not end when Marcus Aurelius died. Rome continued, wars continued, mistakes followed. His son took the throne, and history moved forward with indifference. But something rare had occurred. A man had held absolute power without worshipping it. A ruler had governed without loving command. An emperor had lived and died without confusing authority for meaning. Marcus Aurelius left behind no manifestos, no declarations, no self-crafted legend. Only private words never meant to survive him, words written in the dark, to steady a mind, to restrain a soul. And in a quiet irony, history could not resist. Those words endured longer than his empire, because they spoke not to rulers, but to humans, to anyone who has felt overwhelmed by responsibility, to anyone trapped in a role they did not choose, to anyone struggling to remain themselves under pressure. Marcus Aurelius did not teach us how to rule the world. He taught us how not to be ruled by it. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, in an age louder and more anxious than his own, we still return to the thoughts of a man who never wanted power, and yet carried it with dignity until the very end. The camp grows silent, the lamps fade, and the emperor who hated power finally rests, not as a legend, but as a man who learned, at last, how to let go.